Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Westside UU Church's Easter service. We're glad to have you here today. Thanks so much for coming. I'm the Reverend Carol Bedeau. I'm privileged to serve Westside as minister. Today, we're celebrating our flower communion, the gifts we give and receive in community, and also expanding our definition of community a little bit. We open our service this morning with these chalice lighting words from Westside's first minister, Dillman Baker Sorrells. For holy days on which we recall the old stories, we light this flame. For Passover, which reminds us of the courage and strength of those seeking freedom in the past, we light this flame. For Easter, which reminds us that love is our greatest challenge, we light this flame. For gathering today in sacred space, we light the flame. For the opportunity to be together as community, to remember the past, to plan for the future, and to be alive in the present, we light this flame. We begin our service today with a time of meditation, with a virtual walk through a labyrinth of daffodils that was created by Westside member Carol Coffey. I invite you to simply take a deep breath and enjoy the metaphor that is the walk through the labyrinth, the twisting and turning path of our lives. Sometimes our heads are down while we are surrounded by beauty. I invite you to simply enjoy this labyrinth walk. Big thank you to Carol for sharing that labyrinth experience, for planting
Thank you
that.
to you too.
Yeah, it was beautiful. The lake was beautiful. that day, and the opportunity to get to walk the labyrinth was a real joy. So today, I want to reflect on this phrase that we hear a lot in Unitarian Universalist circles, but that, well, to be really honest, I didn't really know where it came from. So the phrase is an inescapable network of mutuality. So typically, our flower communion is all about how we give and receive from one another, right? We come to the community with gifts, talents, skills, energy, resources, and then we receive things as well. Frequently, what we give and what we receive are different. Like someone might have a lot of time, but not a lot of financial resources. Another person might have financial resources, not a lot of time. Someone else might have a particular talent or a skill, like using, engineering abilities to help take care of the building. So we have all these different gifts and talents that we bring. So in the flower communion, we bring flowers as a representation of what we offer, and we take flowers as a representation of what we receive. And so I was thinking about it, and this phrase, this network of mutuality phrase kept going through my head. And I thought, I really probably need to look that up. So I did. And it gave rise to a reflection that surprised me for today, because it's not the direction I expected to be going with my thoughts about today. And it's because of the context of that quote. That phrase, an inescapable network of mutuality, comes from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. So the context of this is actually far more serious than just sort of like, wow, it's great, it's spring. So I want to share a little bit of the history of this with you, because it was really eye-opening for me, and it's actually particularly relevant for Easter because of the history. So here's the context. So that letter was written in 1963. Now, 15 years before that, President Harry Truman had issued an executive order ending segregation in the armed services. And then a few years later, the Supreme Court had ended segregation in the public schools with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. In 1955, which was a year after schools were officially legally integrated, a young black man, Emmett Till, was murdered in Chicago for allegedly flirting with a white woman. And that same year, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1957, King and a number of other Black pastors and civil rights leaders had started to begin coordinating nonviolent responses to escalating racial violence. So in the fall of 1957, the Little Rock Nine, we've all seen footage of this or photos of it. The Little Rock Nine were the students that were blocked from entering Central High School, causing President Dwight Eisenhower to send in federal troops to escort them into that school. Now, within days of that event, Eisenhower signed the first Civil Rights Act. There were multiple Civil Rights Acts, but the first one was a Voting Rights Act. Things just escalated. The Greensboro Four, which were 4 young African-American college students in North Carolina, refused to give up their seats at a whites-only lunch counter, and that sparked sit-ins around the country. And by the fall of 1960, we saw young Ruby Bridges being escorted by federal marshals into William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. That was memorialized by Norman Rockwell's painting, The Problem We All Live With. So these are all building up. By 1961, there were freedom riders who were actually riding buses through the South to demonstrate against bus segregation. And those freedom riders were met with extreme violence, lots of racial violence. It started to get more national attention. So by the end of 1962, King and these other leaders had been coordinating boycotts. The freedom riders were on the buses. They were also coordinating boycotts of businesses, particularly in really racist areas. So they were protesting, particularly in Birmingham, because it was one of the worst places for racial violence and injustice. They were coordinating these business boycotts, but they weren't having much of an effect.
So they decided around the end of 1962 that they needed to escalate their nonviolent action. And they realized that there are 2 times of year when businesses do a lot of business. One of those is Thanksgiving, Christmas, that little few weeks. And the other time is Easter. So right around Easter is like the second biggest business boom for businesses. And they decided that what they would do was lead a march, a protest march in Birmingham, where the violence was particularly bad, to coincide with the Easter holiday. So actually that phrase is actually really relevant this weekend. So they wanted to disrupt shopping during that Easter week. So on April 12th in 1963, King and 50 other protesters, civil rights leaders, led a Good Friday demonstration. So it was on Good Friday of 1963. They were marching in Birmingham and they were arrested because shortly before that, a new ordinance had been put in place saying that you couldn't gather without a permit. This was King's 13th imprisonment. It was the 13th time he was arrested and put in jail. He was put in solitary confinement. He was not allowed access to his attorney or to his wife. And he had made an agreement with his supporters prior to the march that he did not want them to bail him out. He wanted to remain in jail to call attention to the situation. So they didn't bail him out. So that week, so that was on Friday, Good Friday. He was in jail on, Friday into Saturday. That weekend, a number of religious leaders, both Christian and Jewish, white religious leaders in Birmingham, wrote a letter to a Birmingham newspaper condemning the march and condemning the action, saying that it was extreme and that we didn't need this kind of radical action, and that time would take care of racism all by itself, and that we should just wait and stay in the background. So this was written in the newspaper, and a friend of King smuggled the newspaper article into him in the jail. So his letter from a Birmingham jail is actually a response to this article written by other religious leaders. And his letter is essentially a condemnation of their stance. He wrote, the first parts of the letter were written as notes in the margin of the copy of the article he was given. And then he proceeded to write more and more. The gist of his letter is this: there's no excuse for moderate whites to sit on the sidelines while others are risking their lives for needed change. While moderates urged caution, King insisted that sitting idly by wasn't just dangerous for those already in danger. It was dangerous for everybody. He said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The letter was written and taken out of the jail in little bits and pieces. It was on fragments of paper. And so it was published in little tiny pieces over time. King was released on April 20th. And within a couple of weeks, from May 2nd to May 5th of that same year, 1963, the Children's Crusade started. And what that was school children, all the way from elementary all the way through college age, began leaving their schools and marching in the streets in peaceful protests to protest the racial injustice and violence. The police responded to those children's crusades and marches and protests by using water cannons and dogs to attack the children, and they arrested the children. Now, television footage was taken of those events, and it actually got a lot of white people who'd been previously passive to start acting. In the months that followed the first issuing of the letter, it was published around the country in its entirety, but the racial violence kept escalating. Governor George Wallace refused to integrate the University of Alabama. President Kennedy announced plans for sweeping civil rights legislation, and in August of that same year, 63, King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech as the closing address at the March on Washington, D.C. In September, a few weeks later, the KKK bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 young African-American girls. It was another year before President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of '64, which banned discrimination by employers on the basis of race. And in 65, he signed another Voting Rights Act. Of course, the violence didn't end. In 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in Memphis by James Earl Ray. And of course, we know that's not the end of the story, right? Discrimination isn't over, racial injustice is not over. So my winding labyrinth path, thinking about this phrase, an inescapable network of mutuality, took me places I didn't expect to go for Easter, right? It took me to Easter of 1963 and the context of Dr. King's letter. Our flower communion is a day when we recognize the gifts that we offer and receive in community. And it's a time when we acknowledge mutuality in our relationships, the fact that we all have needs and we all have gifts. So when we bring flowers either to the virtual flower communion or to in-person flower communion, what we're doing is we're saying, this is an offering. This is what I have to share. And when we take flowers, we say, I'm willing to receive. I'm willing to receive. I'm willing to receive things like nurturance, encouragement, support. I'm also maybe willing to receive challenge, growth, new insights. We live in this constant mutuality of giving and taking, and it's a little bit winding, kind of like that labyrinth, right? It's not necessarily a straight, predictable path. Sometimes the path isn't really clear. Sometimes we don't know where we're going. Sometimes we don't know where it's going to take us. And sometimes we have our heads down, focused on our own walking and not necessarily on the larger context. So today, I want to challenge us to expand our vision of mutuality and what it means to be in community is. When we were outside this morning, I spoke about how important it was that we were outside our own doors, that we weren't just inside the walls of our own comfortable community. We were outdoors in our neighborhood, in our larger community. We're connected to this much larger network of mutuality. We're part of a city, we're part of a state, we're part of a nation, we're part of Unitarian Universalism, the thread that runs from the past to the future. We're part of the community of all of life. And of course, we can't hold the complexity of all of that all of the time, but we can encourage ourselves to look a little bit farther than the step right in front of us. We can expand our view out and around, outside of ourselves, outside of the things closest to us, to understand how we are in relationships of mutuality that go beyond where we normally look. Here's the full passage from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All of us are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. So today, as we watch our virtual flower communion, I invite us to think about a couple of things. The first thing is, of course, the needs we have closest to our heart are extremely important. Let us take a moment to just contemplate, what do you need today? What do you need from this community? What do you think you'll need in the coming weeks and months? What's important to you to receive, just as you are able to give? So be with that. But also remember that giving and receiving work best when that flow is ongoing and continuing. We give and we receive and we give again and we receive. And we're not necessarily giving and receiving the same things each time that cycle plays itself out, right? So we have things that we gather in and then things we give back to the world. You know, a lot of times with the in-person flower communion, I realized thinking about this, that I love the flower communion. I love the beauty of the flowers. I take the flowers home, I put them on my dining room table and they just sit there. They just sit there until they die, and then I put them in the compost. And it's great that they go in the compost because that helps. But I never really think about like what happens next. I've never really stopped to think about, okay, I received this thing. Now what? It's really easy to think that giving and receiving is a one-to-one exchange with just one other person or one simple place. But if you ever saw the movie Pay It Forward, right? It's not like that. We receive and we give over here, and they receive and they give somewhere else, and they receive and they give somewhere else. And it's much broader and more cyclical than that. So as I play our flower communion video this morning, these are photos and images that come from our community of beautiful places. Let's take a moment to think about how we share our gifts that we receive from being part of Westside into the larger world. What larger community needs the good energy or the good support or the good care that is restored in you by being part of this, right? Does your family just need some more quiet time like you might get when you come here? Is that something you need to share? Does your neighborhood need more passion for justice that might be sparked here? Does your state or your nation need more energy, more commitment, more action? Does the earth just need some tending? What are the things that for you, you can turn that receiving back out somewhere else in the world? So I invite you to think about that as I share these beautiful images that have come from those in our community.
There is a love holding me. There is a love holding all that I love. There is a love holding all I rest in this love. There is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding
And we have the beautiful Ellen with us here. It's so good to see you, Ellen. Our flower communion this morning wouldn't have been complete without Ellen showing up. So it's great to have you. You know, we have this labyrinth that is our lives, right? And we don't necessarily know where the twists and turns are going to take us. We don't necessarily know what to expect, but we do know that we are held. We are held by a love that is larger than ourselves and by a love that is more than we can see. Community gives us things we don't necessarily understand, we don't necessarily witness, and we give things we don't necessarily understand or realize when we're giving them. So, you know, as we celebrate our flower communion and I'm going to leave the chalice lit for our coffee hour. As we do that, we just acknowledge that we are always in a cycle of giving and receiving and giving again.